Without further ado, good day, and welcome to our next presentation entitled Sheridan, Lawless Mass of Humanity. This Reader's Theater production was written specially for our symposium by Marla Matkin, author. It is an introduction to the disreputable, nefarious, and outrageous characters who, through their lives and deeds, not only wrote but inhabited the pages of Sheridan's history. But before we proceed any further, let me introduce you to Fort Wallace's own cast of interesting and somewhat suspect characters. Leading off is Mark Berry. No theatrical presentation at Fort Wallace would be complete without an appearance by Mr. Berry. His knowledge of history and his comic sensibilities, or lack thereof, make him as interesting as the characters he portrays. He is followed by a seasoned accomplice, Marla Matkin, the instigator and author of our pandemic production. In case you were wondering, pandemic refers to rope fever, not COVID-19. You never know where her theatrical endeavors will take us, but it's always fun to follow along and find out. Its history served funny side up. Next is our own Deb Goodrich, resident historian and trail boss, who has been known to say on more than one occasion regarding historical happenings, "You just can't make this stuff up." So true, but Deb can sure tell a whale of a tale, or more precisely, a monster-sized dragon's tale. New to the group is Tony Burnett, Esquire. Initiated under fire when he was employed at the museum, he took a liking to the group's unique brand of lunacy and now is a lifetime member of the asylum. Congratulations.
Thank you.
It's good to have him join us whenever he can. And I'm Jane Humphrey Pierce, your host and narrator. Now on with the show. Let us return to those thrilling days of yesteryear. The location is western Kansas, and a town that was but is no more, Sheridan, Kansas. I set the mood for you by sharing a quote from author Heidi Barr. "Once in another lifetime, there was an ocean here, and if you plant your feet in the soil, you can almost feel the ancients rising and falling like the tides of old." So without further ado, we present for your edification, Sheridan, Lawless Mass of Humanity.
The country had its share of air towns that disappeared in a puff of locomotive smoke, leaving little evidence that they had ever existed. Sheridan was just such an end-of-track town on the old Kansas Pacific Railroad. It provided shelter for a couple of thousand people, and it marked the spot where the government land grant to the railroad ended. Until more land was made available, all railroad construction came to an abrupt halt, and for better or worse, Sheridan was born. Although it disappeared in a matter of months, it left us with some hell-raising tales of life at the end of the line. The town wasn't much to look at, as it was made up of mud huts, dugouts, tents, and tin sheds that were built so they could be loaded on flat cars and moved to the next stopping place. Situated on the side of a desolate ravine, the everlasting plain embraced it. Two solitary buttes, named Hurlbut and Lawrence, had been placed on guard over the region by nature, and were as wretched and dismal as sentinels in a penal settlement. Sheridan was christened after the gallant, Civil War General Philip Sheridan. In fact, when he was introduced to his namesake, he remarked that it strongly resembled the Battle of the Shenandoah Valley. The yelling of the Irish mob on payday reminded him of Stonewall Jackson's battalions, wild and out of control. That's where my family was. The community drew the riffraff of society to it like a magnet. 31 men were soon hanged from the railroad trestle on the east edge of the city. Some considered the everyday fracases that took place to be just friendly fights with pistols, but with the admonition, may the best man win. Dozens of graves would eventually occupy the ridge overlooking the town site, and not one of those wretched souls died of natural causes, unless, of course, the more broad-minded among you consider lead poisoning to be a natural cause. Anywhere else, a jury of your peers might have been more lenient, but in Sheridan, the best you could hope for was a kangaroo court presided over by Judge Lynch. It was often a matter of somebody was going to pay, and not necessarily with money. South of the tracks lived the Irish, who were the laborers employed by the railroad. Along with their families, they occupied a cluster of tin shacks and dugouts known as Rat Row. Not necessarily a safe part of town to visit, as typical Irish logic seldom differentiated between friend or foe, particularly when intoxicated. Decent folks, and there were a few, were left for the most part unmolested, but were nervous nonetheless. You always had to remember that when taking in the sights, you didn't want to become one of them. Despite its lawless nature, Sheridan was a city of commerce. Warehouses, housing outfitting, and merchandising firms furnished forts in the southwest with supplies. These essential goods were freighted by bull wagons often numbering 1,000. 1,000 were seen camped at the foot of a nearby hill. Of course, saloons outnumbered all other businesses, the Dewdrop Inn being the most popular. Of still greater interest to many were the little shacks behind the saloons, which were inhabited by Sheridan's girls, the town's numerous ladies of many charms and easy virtue. Whether known as a soiled dove, fallen angel, or Cyprian, a rose by any other name wouldn't have smelled near as sweet. But before one house was built or one street surveyed, the engineer was called upon to plot a graveyard, which was located upon a ridge overlooking the town. In the day, "I'll give you a high lot," was a threat in Sheridan and meant 6 feet of soil on the hillside. It was often accompanied by the promise, "You'll be dancing in thin air before sunset." The first inhabitants moved into that quarter, quote, with their boots on. It could be said they sure knew how to make a man feel at home. They even dug him one with a warm covering of topsoil. Nowhere else on the vastness of the plains was the uniqueness of Sheridan equaled. Welcome to Sheridan, Kansas. Just be careful you don't succumb to rope fever.
Now that you've been given an overview of Sheridan's fascinating but storied history, it's time you met the thieves, murderers, and malcontents you've heard so much about. Much of the information that we will share with you is found in the first-hand accounts of de Benneville's Randolph Keim, Miguel Antonio Otero, and William Edward Webb, as well as select material from Harper's New Monthly magazine. The stories are told as they would have been in the 19th century, and may not, in some instances, reflect the social and cultural values and sensibilities of the 21st century. But they provide us with important insight into Sheridan's history. So now I suggest you make yourself comfortable, because we're bound for the promised land.
I am bound for the promised land. I'm bound for the promised land. Oh, who will come and go with me? I am bound for the promised land. Oh, who will come and go with me? I am bound for the promised land. Oh, Shenandoah, I long to hear you roll away, you rolling river. Oh, Shenandoah, I'm sure to leave you away. I'm bound away, across the wide Missouri. Kansas,
The
Promised
Promised Land.
Land for all.
the
Promised
Promised Land.
And Game aplenty.
The
The
Promised Land.
The golden harvest.
The
Promised
Promised Land. I am bound for the Promised Land. I'm bound for the Promised Land. Oh, who will come and go with me? I am bound for the Promised Land.
In 1868, a journalist for the New York Herald by the name of de Benneville Randolph Keim paid a short but memorable visit to Sheridan. His reporting was noted for its accuracy and wealth of detail, and he definitely knew a good story when he saw one. And Sheridan had more than its share of colorful characters and stories that were sure to interest his readers.
Upon my arrival in the metropolis of Sheridan, I negotiated for quarters at the hotel. There being but one place, the choice was not difficult. At bedtime, I was escorted to a small enclosure directly over the bar room. I enjoyed a vivifying anxiety and trepidation in anticipation of a pistol ball or two finding its way through the thin floor into my bed. The sort of bedfellow I certainly had no desire to cultivate. All the frontier slang, crudely fashioned oaths, and unpolished vulgarities, inspired by the oft-repeated charges of chain lightning, which electrified the boisterous crowd below, greatly hampered my attempts at slumber, which were anything but satisfactory. They say a deep sleep is better left to the dead. All I know is that on that occasion I desired one, but hoped to avoid the other. Another dangerous situation, involving my adventurous spirit and lack of good judgment, found me engaged in a buffalo hunt that I will not soon repeat. During our journey, we were passing through immense herds of buffalo. Taking my rifle, I posted myself on the cow catcher, or rather the buffalo catcher of the locomotive. After proceeding about 10 miles, we came upon a large herd crossing the track. The locomotive pursued its course without reduction of speed. Approaching the herd rather rapidly, I did not favor the idea of receiving a buffalo in my lap, a fact growing more probable. The herd passed, but one animal was lagging in the rear out of bewilderment or reckless daring, planting himself in the middle of the track with his head down in such a way as to say, "Come on, whoever you are, and we'll try." As I felt no relish to be party of any cranial collision, and finding no other convenient place, I took a conspicuous but uncomfortable place on the steam chest, holding on by the rail. I found the temperature, as far as my feet were concerned, anything but desirable, but in momentary anticipation of rare display of buffalo meat, kept a lookout for the pieces. At this moment, the whistle blew, and the buffalo, startled at the shrill sound, made an effort to get out of the way. He succeeded only to a point, as his posteriors were pretty well damaged, and he was minus his tail. It all came to an end, you might say, but a series of acrobatic exercises over the embankment. A disaster averted, I wiped the sweat from my brow and carried on.
William Edward Webb, author of Buffalo Land, provides readers with an authentic narrative of the adventures and misadventures of a scientific and sporting party upon the Great Plains of the West. This group of men made significant contributions to the science of paleontology, often receiving little to no credit for their efforts. But Webb's account of their activities while in Sheridan is fascinating, to be sure, as the following story illustrates.
The shades of night had just settled over Sheridan upon the evening of our arrival, when Abe, our hostler guide, came running to us with the information that Honest Rumbo, another of our hostlers, was being hanged by some of the good citizens of the community. The site chosen for this little diversion was the infamous railroad trestle to the east of town. We were already acquainted with the Sheridanites' penchant for hanging people, so action needed to be taken. Armed, we set off for rescue. We'd barely gone 100 yards when we met the lynchers returning. At the head, with a dirty piece of rope around his neck, walked our hostler, trembling all over and chattering broken English rapidly, in mingled fright and anger. We were told by their leader that there was sufficient evidence for a hanging, and an extra session of court had been called for immediately. We were invited to seats on the jury, and of all places, the trial was to be held in Rumbo's own house, with his wife Marie in attendance.
If you will pardon the interruption, there is another story to be told that will deal or shed more light on the case. You see, 2 years earlier, Jules Paget, a native of France, accompanied by his young wife, the lovely Marie, arrived at the railroad at Hays, Kansas. Both found ready employment and lived in a dugout below Hays, happy and prosperous. But within a year, who should arrive on the scene but Honest Rambo? Across the water, he and Jules had been rival suitors for Marie's hand. But strangely enough, the newcomer was welcomed and taken into their humble abode by the young couple. That year came the great rainstorm, when so many families in western Kansas and Texas were drowned. The rain fell heavily on the night of the great flood. Many dwellers in dugouts sprang from their beds into water to find their exit by doors impossible, and many escaped through chimneys or roofs. The horrors of that night are indescribable. Above was the roar of the waters descending below as they rolled madly onward, carrying the wreck of farms and corpses by the score. That night, Jules, the husband, perished, but Honest Rambo and Marie were rescued from the roof of their dwelling. When the flood subsided, the bodies of Jules was taken from the wash in the fireplace, but the bony finger of suspicion was pointed directly at Honest Rambo, when an ugly wound was found in the dead husband's hair and his fingers bruised. It was speculated that after assisting his wife's escape, he was struck on the head when attempting to climb to safety. While still clinging to the chimney, his fingers were pounded until their hold was loosened. Then, a mere 3 weeks later, Rambo and Marie were married. It might be worthwhile to note that Rambo had spoken many times of a vine-covered cottage in France where pretty Marie watched and waited until her lover could earn sufficient dowry to return and claim the love of his life. It was the old story. A maiden fair tarried in Europe while a true knight ransacked foreign lands for fame and fortune, and long since had one and all, save Sikkim, exhausted their stock of spare change to hasten the reunion. But had the couple been willing to take part in foul play to achieve their long-awaited happily ever after?
That is most interesting, I agree. But if you will permit, I return to the events of the night of the trial. Passing better establishments, the men were led to a dugout where they were greeted by a fat, gaily dressed Frenchwoman. This was Rambo's wife and house. What a Marie! What a vine-covered cottage! Not at all what we expected. Now, gentlemen, said the foreman, rising from a barrel, when the evidence was all in, the question for the jury to decide is, was the water that did it? There was doubt existing in the case, so we gave the prisoner the benefit of a doubt. But there was murder in the air, and Rambo knew it. Before morning, he had departed for parts unknown. Marie said for La Belle France, but as many citizens believed, he was bound for Texas. Of course, true love never did run smooth, but in this case, love, sweet love, made its way all the way from France to Texas by way of Kansas.
At the foot of the buttes was a large, water-filled depression with the novel name of Lake Como. One of Sheridan's citizens later wrote, "I went there swimming once and stepped upon the face of a dead man, an experience which will stay with you through a lifetime. Upon dragging the body from the water, it was found to be that of a local gambler. His pockets were stuffed full of rocks, and a knave of hearts was pinned to his hand. Investigation disclosed he had been taking liberties with a favorably inclined married colleen of the town. Her husband, using Sheridan Justice as his guide, permanently made sure the gambler would no longer practice his nefarious ways." Now, justice in Sheridan was often dealt out on a tit-for-tat basis. The vengeful husband was soon tracked down, and in the melee that ensued was shot in the arm, which was then placed in a sling. Together with his good arm, they were tied behind his back with the same rope that had been used to tie the arms of the dead gambler. The rope, which had been prepared with the usual hangman's knot, was now placed about the neck of the young man, and without a word he was marched off to the trestle-work bridge and hanged. This summary execution was certainly an object lesson to anyone who might attempt to interfere with the established practices of the Vigilance Committee. Of course, a find of this nature created excitement for only a short time in Sheridan, as a similar discovery or shooting would soon take its place.
At the time of my visit, Sheridan was in a state of siege. Several days before, a large war party of Indians had appeared on the buttes near the town and opened fire on the inhabitants. Everyone rushed to arms, and for the larger part of a day, a spirited fusillade was kept up. The people of the place at once organized a regular corps of defenders, and detachments were on watch day and night. On more prominent eminences, pickets were posted to signal the approach of war parties. As for me, I left the fighting to those with more experience.
Miguel Antonio Otero would in later years recall memories of his time spent in Sheridan as a child. His father, for whom he was named, had been a partner in the enterprising firm of Otero and Sellers. The family's prominence in the community provided him with a front row seat from which he could observe the town and its people. Miguel would eventually go on to become the 15th governor of New Mexico, but his time in Sheridan provided fascinating material for his book, My Life on the Frontier.
As you already know, there were no written laws or sworn law enforcement establishments in this illustrious town of Sheridan. I guess they saw no need. But the Vigilance Committee, to which you've already been introduced, was quite active. And if you were wise, you didn't object or interfere with the actions or procedures of this aforementioned community. While the Vigilance Committee was trying to improve conditions inside the town by their standards, the Indians and stock rustlers were making things lively for the railroad builders and the freighters on the outskirts. Frequently, dead men were brought into Sheridan, their bodies mutilated, unmistakable indications of Indian atrocity. The stock rustlers often joined with the tribesmen in running off horses and cattle, and were even worse than the Indians themselves, for they were more intelligent and more cruel. But even greater interest to me is at that time General Sheridan and General Custer were in the field, attempting to round up the fighting Indians and force them back onto their reservations. Frequently, the two generals would meet in Sheridan, stop over for the day and a night while awaiting dispatches. On such occasions, they would dine in the Otero home, and Miguel and his brothers would hear the wonderful tales of hunting and Indian fighting. When it was time for the youngsters to retire, their mother would join them, leaving the men to enjoy themselves, drinking champagne and fine old whiskey, and smoking and talking until late at night. I don't know about you, but what I wouldn't have given to have given the opportunity to light my pipe and join those men in what would have been some lively conversations.
On a lighter note, from many of the stories that have and will be told, is one regarding the great whiskey caper. I repeat it as it was told to me. The warehouses belonging to the firm of Otero and Sellers, in which the whiskey barrels were kept, were built on wooden pilings or logs 4 feet high, which left enough space underneath the floor for anyone to pass freely. On the inside, the flooring and the platforms on which the barrels rested were made of rough 2-inch boards. Practically all of these boards had 2-inch auger holes near the end, made by the lumbermen in order to raft them together securely with ropes while bringing them down the river. Many of the whiskey barrels were placed head up directly over some of the auger holes. One day, in shifting some of the barrels, it was discovered that an apparently empty barrel could not be moved because it was held to the floor by something. An investigation disclosed that some ambitious thief had wriggled under the warehouse with a brace and bit, and aided by one of those auger holes, had bored a hole into the barrel and then had inserted a brass faucet. Through this means, he had been able to drain out every drop of whiskey in the barrel. While the culprit was never apprehended, the crime was more one of amusement rather than a hanging offense. It's nice to know that even Sheridanites had a sense of humor.
Among the wonders of Sheridan then on exhibition were the remains of a saurian animal discovered near the town by a Swiss watchmaker, Louis Brandt. The reptile measured over 50 feet, was found in the same area as Fort Wallace's plesiosaur. A 4-foot section of the creature's jaw was found. The cone-shaped teeth were still perfect. From this portion of the jaw, it was determined that it may have originally been closer to 60 feet in length. 6 feet for the skull. When found, the creature was lying near the surface with parts of the specimen exposed. It appeared to have been moving across a canyon at the time of death, and so lay with its head on one side and its tail on the other, while the center space of several feet was washed away. The species to which it belonged swarmed in immense numbers, but were surrounded by monsters even more remarkable. The country was wonderfully prolific in petrifications of all kinds. There was no doubt in my mind that the numerous exhibitions of sublime formations, that the entire country had once formed the bed of a vast inland sea. For the convenience of the curious, the remains were arranged on a table in the rear of Brandt's shop. I'm told that the specimen represents the remains of a Mosasaurus. It now resides in a museum in Cambridge, Massachusetts. But even the scholars were hard-pressed to equal Louis Brandt's excitement when he showed off his unusual find. As I have your attention, I share with you yet another point of interest. I know it had been stated that Sheridan was recognized as a center of commerce, but they failed to mention that the business of Sheridan was monopolized almost exclusively by the enterprising, homeless race, the Jews. The modern representatives of ancient and numerous family circles were probably more completely illustrated upon the plains than anywhere else. It was only the new importations from Germany who constituted the species sent out west. It was the rare exception to find an Americanized member of the family exposing himself to the dangers of a scalpless pate. The favorite branch of business to which they devoted their attention was the sale of clothing and cheap notions. If any Indian or of a friendly band happened near at hand, they drove a fair trade by bartering their cheap commodities at high rates for skins at low rate. These pioneers were generally representatives of larger establishments in the East, set up in trade by advances in supplies of goods on easy terms. They were sent out into remote regions of the plains and cut their eye teeth. Everybody needs to start somewhere. Isn't that what they say?
Morals in this mushroom town were considered among the articles of commerce. No one tried to possess any unless money was to be made by it. On occasion, an individual thought it worthwhile to forgo women, wine, and cards long enough to inspire confidence and run away with some of his fellow townsmen's ducats. From motives of courtesy, particular women were called wives, but it was well to avoid inquisitiveness on the subject. I remember one day when a certain couple arrived by stage. It was easy to see they were fugitives. Of the two, the woman was the oldest, and it appeared to be a case in which she was running off with the man. They soon obtained passage on a Mexican train for Santa Fe. 2 days afterwards, a pursuing husband arrived in Sheridan. His questions were few and to the point. Having learned that the fugitives were 2 days' journey away on the desolate plain, he simply fired up with an extra chip of Navy plug, thrust both hands deep down into his pockets, and remarked, "The old gal's tongue cuts like a cart whip. 'Fore next spring, there'll be one man sorry I didn't catch up." In this storyteller's opinion, enough said.
You can't tell the story of Sheridan without including our next unforgettable character. Words don't do justice in describing him either in appearance or behavior. Is he truly evil or a victim of life's inequalities? Does he deserve our pity or our utmost disgust? We'll let you be the judge.
Among Sheridan's very peculiar characters, the strangest one was known as Gesso, a shrunken little figure with a humped back and a shriveled hand. On the deformed trunk was rested a well-balanced head with click, full eyes, and a face very difficult to read. In it was a touch of humor, much bitterness, and a suggestion of malice. When nature painted the face, she had, like an artist hurried at her work, touched up the rough features with suggestions of passion in so faint an outline that you broke their thread of character whenever attempting to grasp it. This man was one of those contradictions in life whom it would have been unsafe to judge by either phrenological or instinctive rules. In the frontier vernacular, he wouldn't do to swear by. His name was taken from his favorite expression, just so. Had you flung the lie into his teeth or given him a blow, he would have first said, "Gesso," then pierced your heart with a bullet. This hero first appeared in Sheridan as a conductor of a Mexican wagon train. With him came a young girl, rather fair to look upon, and bearing the fiery dash of the sunland in her eyes. It transpired that she was one of the many foundling waifs of New Mexico and had been raised from childhood by the dwarf. His shrunken hand was the result of it being crushed under a heavy wagon wheel while its companion was pulling the child out of danger. What he had for the girl, other than a stepfather's love, will never be known. He had brought her thus far east to be away from the wretched immorality of New Mexico. Bad enough himself, yet he would not see the young life so dear to him sink down in that terrible whirlpool. Gesso was jealous, watchful, and the girl spoiled and capricious. With some of the beauty of the Mexican maidens, she had all of their coquetry. Before his life had measured out one brief week in Sheridan, the dwarf enjoyed 2 fights on account of the adopted daughter. Ere a fortnight passed, she was missing one bright morning, and so was a light-fingered bunny, or Bonnie, the hero of the previous quarrels. It was a bad sight to see the dwarf that morning. He crept around town like a wildcat, wetting its claws on the graveling soil and preparing to spring. Ruggles, the postmaster, asked him if he should pursue, and he gasped out a wicked, merciless Gesso. There was more hell, the postmaster said, in that look than he had ever expected to see on earth. The eyes had the red madness of a soul on fire. There were windows reflecting the dull glare of leaping flames beneath him. Before noon, Gesso had left town. Perry, the hotel keeper, gathering moss agates on the buttes, saw him, like a wolf upon a trail, steal off among the ravines along the Santa Fe Road. 2 weeks afterward, a Mexican train arrived in town, and the wagon master reported the following occurrence. Near the crossing of the Purgatory, his men, while grazing the oxen, came upon 2 dead bodies, thus grotesquely situated.
There was an old feed box for a table, and on each side sat a corpse, one of a woman, the other of a man. Evidently placed in a sitting posture after death, their heads had fallen close together, and their hands, which lay upon each other, covered a Catholic prayer book. The work of murder had been bunglingly done in the case of the girl, as if the slayer's hand had half refused the task. The wagon master even thought, from the clotted blood on her hair and the character of the wounds, that she might have fallen while warding off from her companion the blows of a sudden night attack. It was a ghastly marriage the murderer had performed in uniting the stiffening fingers of the sorrowful couple, while death stood by as priest. The dreadful coolness of the avenger, who could thus slay and then arrange the dead in mimicry of marriage, belonged peculiarly to the plain. It was a month or more before Gesso returned to Sheridan. Interest in the matter had then died out, and I do not know whether any question about it was ever asked. The dwarf drank and fought and gambled, and was one of the characters as before.
We went over to a spot on the hillside which contains the graves of 14 persons, 12 of whom died violent deaths. They were young men in the prime of life, and many of them had received a good education. Mr. Ruggles informed us, in his position as postmaster, he had received numerous letters from friends of the victims, showing that many of them, only years before, were living in respectable homes and were the pride and hope of aged parents. In the same vein, another story came to my attention, and I share it with you as reported in the Leavenworth Times. The man who was hanged here as a desperate thief and murderer was named Davis. After his death, the harlots took his body, refusing to have it buried with the other desperadoes, and gave it a funeral and burial, with those wretched women being the only mourners. Not long afterwards, letters were received from a respectable young lady in Illinois to whom Davis had been engaged, giving his history and representing him as one of the most prominent young men in the country. His story is only one of many which we have heard here, and fitly illustrates the influence of intemperance and crime. I repeat, as others have said before me, there has been no law here, no legal officers or organizations, and all the restraints of law and society have been thrown off, and thus have human beings been changed into wolves.
Burials were devoid of any pious funeral ceremony. Churches and religion were never part of Sheridan. There was a coroner of sorts who was responsible for returning any valuables to relatives of the deceased, but there never seemed to be any. As a consequence, the coroner became one of the more moneyed men in town. On occasion, not even the departed's clothing was sacred, and many of them went to their final resting place wrapped in nothing more than a blanket. Join with us now as we take this opportunity to pay our respects to those souls buried in Sheridan's graveyard on the hill. Without benefit of a heartfelt prayer of forgiveness, or the comforting sound of a hymn. We begin with a portion of the poem entitled Let Me Die on the Prairie by Frances Jane Crosby Van Alstyne. Let me die on the prairie, and o'er my rude grave, in the soft breeze of summer, the tall grass shall wave. I would breathe my last sigh as the bright hues of even are melting away in the blue arch of heaven. Oh, speak not to me of the green cypress shade. I would sleep where the bones of the Indian are laid, and the deer will bound o'er me with step light and free, and the carol of the birds will my requiem be.
Softly and tenderly, Jesus is calling, calling for you and for me. See on the portals he's waiting and watching, watching for you and for me. Come home, come home. Ye who are weary, come home. Earnestly, tenderly, Jesus is calling, calling us sinner, come home.
Unfortunately, many episodes of these air towns are all tragedy. Such is the tale of Gunshot Frank and Sour Bill, two noted bullies. Having quarreled, each armed himself with a revolver and put a spade on his left shoulder, and with a few friends started off for a spot near the buttes to fight a duel. The plan was that after arriving on the ground, each man should dig a grave for the other, and then exchange places and fight on the edge of the graves. But before the work was half done, Gunshot made an impotent remark, one he would soon regret. Bill responded by shooting him through the abdomen. The dead man's friends at once fell upon the murderer, and one of them broke in his skull with a spade. That night, the two men slept in the graves of their own hands had helped dig. There's just no cure for stupid, and if nothing else, it's certainly a poor example of one good turn deserves another.
You might ask how the dregs of society found their way to Sheridan. Well, why not? The West was the perfect place to lose oneself, particularly if you were running away from the long arm of the law, or possibly a wife, or responsibility you no longer wanted to keep. You simply changed your name once, twice, or how many times necessary. Who was going to ask questions? If your bad habits accompanied you and got in the way of your success, just pack up, keep moving westward, unless, of course, you end up in jail or the end of a rope. After all, when you rub shoulders with characters the likes of Neb the Devil's Own, Ascension Stephen, or Gunshot Frank and Sour Bill, you obviously aren't picky.
What was your name in the States? Was it Thompson or Johnson or Bates? Did you happen to draw on your mother-in-law or sink the old lady with weights, my friend? Oh, what was your name in the States? Oh, what was your name in the States? Was it Murphy, McDonald, or Gates? Did you hold up a bank as a juvenile prank and pack up the money in crates, my friend? Oh, what was your name in the States? Fess up. Oh, what was your name in the States? Now, you must have had some honest traits, but I doubt it. Did you try to abscond with a beautiful blonde? Such minor offenses we tolerate. Oh, what was your name in the States? Tell the truth now. Oh, what was your name in New York? Was it Clancy, O'Toole, or O'Rourke? Are you wanted for life because you left your poor wife when she caught you smelling a cork, my friend? Oh, what was your name in New York? Oh, what was your name in the East? And how recently was you released? Are you riding the rails because you held up the males? Or was it the females you held? You beast! Oh, what was your name in the East? Oh, what was your name in the States? Though you suffer the cruelest of fates. Out here in the West, everybody's a guest, so line up and fill up your plates, my friend. Whoever you are in the States, yahoo!
There were many queer characters developed in this rough town. For instance, a pettifogger from New York became Neb the Devil's Own. Neb was an abbreviation of Nebuchadnezzar, which title he won from taking so naturally to grass, or more correctly to the prairie, when it was necessary to hide on account of misdeeds. Had anyone been interested enough to make weekly inquiries about Neb's whereabouts, the answer would generally have been out to grass. On 2 occasions, he sent men to eternity without them previously using a bootjack. Once, when an Irish mob was celebrating payday in Rat Row, a favorite street of the Paddies, Neb ran out of the hotel opposite and emptied 16 shots from a Henry rifle among the Patricks and the Bridgets. No one was killed, but the Devil's Own found it necessary to go into exile on the back of a stray mule, followed for hundreds of yards by a howling mob and a shower of bullets. When 1 week later, Neb appeared in Sheridan's society again, he wore a pair of Uncle Samuel's bracelets and was charged with counterfeiting Samuel's paper. From the rickety jail, he was taken the ensuing nights and hung on the railroad trestle adjoining town. It then transpired he had been chief of a gang who manufactured the queer money in a dugout near Sheridan. Under the body as mourner next morning was found his daughter, who had never been in that vicinity before. She was a bright, sweet-faced girl from the area near Rutland, Vermont, and it was learned had been summoned west that week by her father for the purpose of accompanying him to California. Neb had accumulated quite a little sum of money and evidently intended on settling down for life elsewhere when the last fatal spree settled him under the wailing grass over which he had so often fled like a fox. Some effort was made to send the young girl back, but her better nature was crushed by the shame of her father's life and death. Poor thing! I saw her some months afterward and felt that better would it have been had death spread his cold but charitable wings over the daughter when he smote the father.
Another character of celebrity in Sheridan was Ascension Stephen. This worthy was a half-witted Millerite who climbed the 2 buttes once or twice every month with a saloon tablecloth in his pocket that might answer for a rapper when the great trumpet should sound. Fine evenings were often spent by him in this weary and lonely waiting, and one occasion he frightened the wits out of some drunken Irishmen by rushing down the hill toward them as they were returning from a wild debauch. So well did the tablecloth do its duty on this occasion that for the first time in months, the Irishman reached home sober. A more effective temperance banner had never fluttered in the breeze. One reply of Stevens was worth a less addled brain than his. From it was given a satisfactory reason why Adventists should cleave to property, when on the eve of Ascension Day, he was asked to give up his shanty and an old horse he possessed on the day preceding that which he declared should witness the dissolution of Sheridan and all things terrestrial. Why should you keep this property? His covetous questioner. You brought nothing in the world, and you can take nothing out. True enough, mon, Stephen in his odd brogue, but didn't you ken the Lord said, occupy until I come.
The passenger of the plains today will find at the station of Sheridan not a solitary house. There are no streets and no other vestiges of former habitation. The position of any former blocks could not be found without a new survey. No other air town had the population, transacted the business, or abounded with such violence for so short a period of time, then disappeared off the face of the earth. An air castle could not have faded out more completely than the air town known as Sheridan. I share with you now what Laura Ingalls Wilder so beautifully wrote in her book, Little House on the Prairie, that speaks to the prairie's ability to reclaim its sovereignty. There was only the enormous empty prairie, with grasses blowing in waves of light and shadow across it, and the great blue sky above it, and birds flying up from it and singing with joy because the sun was rising. And on the whole enormous prairie, there was no sign that any other human being had ever been there. We hope you have enjoyed our presentation, and thank you for being here this afternoon. Marla, step forward and take a bow. Marla Matkin, ladies and gentlemen.
I have a little recognition for my cast. I've been doing these plays at Fort Larned and Fort Hays here, and because we come from the Four Corners, we never have a chance to have a cast party. So at occasions, I've had a breakfast and I've given away gag gifts. But I thought, where it's kind of semi-formal today, that these people deserved an award. After all, we're in award season right now. It's People's Choice, Golden Globes, Emmys, Tonys.
I'll take a Tony.
And Oscars. So a few years ago, we were going through, I think, the catch-all room, and we came across two original Elves on the Shelf. And and they found their way everywhere. Not only they appeared at Christmas, but they were in the strongbox on the stagecoach. One of them was about Singed. So we've had a lot of fun with these little elves on the shelf. And I found some things here that, now I will admit that I did get these on clearance, but if you go to eBay, these things are going up in price. They may become a collector's item. So I expect that you find a place, noteworthy place in your home to display these very valuable awards. And in fact, Meryl Streep does not even have one of these.
Oh, wow.
So,
Wow.
so the coveted Elf on the Shelf Award.
Oh,
Ooh.
thank you so much. What an honor.
Thank you.
We got our own elves on the shelf.
And one
Thank
final
you.
comment. There is, I don't know if it's a public service announcement that is circulating on TV, and I don't know if you've seen it, probably you have, but I was very moved by it. And it is a montage of black and white still and film clips, primarily from the first part of the 20th century. And the one that caught my attention because it was so Kansas was a couple running through the wind, dirt, and dust of the Dust Bowl into a sod house. But the message at the end says it all. There have always been hard times, but there have always been resilient people. May you, I, and all of us here always be resilient people.
Amen. Great job.
It'll
Thank
go
you.
right next to my D.K. Clark corner. What a day.
What time is it? It's 4 o'clock? Okay, so everybody's going to work together to get ready for the next hour. So what we're going to do is we need to get